There is a poem in the comments.
Or question.
Or a question. Yeah. Sorry, not a poem.
It would be amazing if someone wrote a poem in response to one of my poems in the comment section.
So Russell Rankle
that,
says,
please.
I love the poem with the juxtaposition of two people. How did you decide on the two characters?
Oh, well, I mean, I actually have about a dozen poems with that structure. So how I chose those two characters or individuals, in let's say one of them, I think, let's grab those two poems. So yeah, I have quite a few of them like this. I just really, once I did one or two, I really enjoyed it. I don't remember, I think the Emmett Till Edward Hopper one was actually the first one, I believe. And a lot of it, I think for that particular one, a lot of it for me had to do with how much I love Edward Hopper. I have a couple Edward Hopper pieces actually, here in my room even. And I was, happened to be flipping through a book, and his landscapes have always struck me. I always feel like there's a story behind them, which is, I'm not a visual artist, but one thing I love about certain kinds of visual art is an implied story. It reminds me a lot of poetry in that regard. Like I have to fill in the blanks, but when I see, what is it called? House by the Rail Tracks by Edward Hopper, in this old, obviously abandoned house, totally all the grass overgrown, train tracks going across it. To me, that always feels like obviously someone used to live there. That train track used to be bustling to me, but now there's either another railroad or of course cars and highways, things like that. And then, so the people moved away. Maybe it's not even a town anymore, and it's just this old house, old train tracks. I always feel like there's a story behind his work. And of course, a lot of them have white people looking very sad, not talking to each other. So in looking through those images, I was starting to put something together anyway, and then I just wondered how it would contrast if I brought using his imagery, exclusively his imagery, but then I brought to the forefront kind of the whiteness of the characters in a lot of his art, and then how, what I could contrast that against. And yeah, a lot of it came from that. When flipping through a book of his art, one of them had a bridge in it, and then for some reason I saw that bridge and that reminded me of what happened to Emmett Till, and then it just kind of came together. It sounds straight up, that poem, the Emmett Till poem, ended up winning an award. It's not in a book yet because I just wrote it earlier this year, but it won an award and did all this stuff. It's one of the poems that kind of got out in the world a little bit more than others. And I think I wrote it in 2 hours. I had my book of Edward Hopper art. I'm very familiar with what happened to Emmett Till, and it just all kind of came together. And with the Rosa Parks and Banksy too, a lot. I knew I wanted to be a woman because in that Banksy image, there's a little girl letting go of a balloon. So I was picturing, and then we still have that child inside of us. I was talking to my father's in his 70s about that, and like, he still remembers him, he still pictures himself as a little boy and a 30-year-old and a 60-year-old. We were always like that. And I was picturing, inside Rosa Parks, the little girl letting go of the red balloon from the Banksy image ends up being the little girl that's still alive inside Rosa that would give her the courage to do what she did. So a lot of, not all, but a lot of them have an artist paired with an important historical figure. And I don't know, they come more easily than you think, but they do usually involve a bit more research than most poems, just to make sure I want to make sure I get everything right, obviously too. But they're a lot of fun, yeah. And some of them are a little bit more fun. I have one with Cthulhu in it, for example. I have one with the Frankenstein monster in it. So some are a little bit more fun, but thank you, good question. Those are great poems. They're great poems. It's great to be able to find a concept that you can latch onto and that could be almost never ending. I can write those kinds of poems forever.
Awesome. We got a couple questions. One from Sonny Wilkinson, one from Dana. Can you read them, John, or do you want me to read them out loud?
Either one.
Okay, cool. So Sonny asked and mentioned, the Pompeii poem is just stunning. In several of these poems, you seem to look back to a moment in history to shed light on something now. What do you think poetry can do with history that prose might not be able to do?
Wow. I think, wow, that's great. And although I shouldn't speak to prose, I don't want to draw, a stark line there by any means, but one of the things that resonates most with me is when for me, poetry is all about I hate to say it, it's all about the tangible in some ways. Like there's something that I need access to. And it's difficult sometimes in a purely historical poem. Sometimes it's difficult for me to find that entry point, in that it begins to feel more, even if it's a poem, it almost feels more prosy or potentially more preachy, or something like that. So being able to bring in something from the present day, or to be able to bring in a little bit of your own perspective or your own life or something within that historical context, to me, that's often where the emotion gets sparked. So with the poems that have some sort of history involved, I usually only touch on the history lightly, because I grew up, reading, and I read a lot of, Borges, and I used to read back in my early 20s. I read a lot of Eastern European poetry. You go through phases. I read a lot of those, and I was like, that was, I think, before Wikipedia 20 years ago. But I virtually had to have a dictionary next to me. I was like, I don't know who this person is, or not dictionary, an encyclopedia. It's like there were like reference points that I wasn't getting. So when I bring up historical things, I tend to try to approach things that are relatively well known, so someone doesn't necessarily have to research them. And then I try to bring them more into a contemporary context. I guess for me, it's just much more emotional. It's more intimate, as opposed to a poem that's in the past tense of something that once happened, trying to bring what happened into the present day using the present tense, to me, is important. That's usually where for me, the emotion is sparked from. But also, of course, just in a more, I guess, philosophical sense, the fact that history just repeats and repeats and repeats. So I'm not really even sure how to define it. What is yesterday history? So it feels like we're always making the same mistakes. We're repeating the same successes also as a species. So yeah, it doesn't feel like, you could read something about Rome, and what was going on earlier this year, and seeing in Italy, they actually, I think in some other places too, but I remember seeing images in Italy where people were bringing carts around to put people who had passed from COVID. That's just like in the Black Plague, things just repeat and repeat. So, yeah, I don't know.
Great answer.
Yeah. So that Sunny, who asked that question, has also been in Sugar House Review really recently in our 10-year anniversary issue. So, and she has a great book out right now as well. So Dana asks, John, how do you wade bravely into difficult territory in poetry, particularly regarding race and privilege? Do you worry about making a misstep?
Every single word. Every word. How do I go? Well, the reason I go into it is because I can't not. I just feel I'm not someone who at all believes that poetry is this or is that, or a poet should do this or should do that. Even if we're in the middle of the type of thing we're in the middle of right now, that doesn't mean people shouldn't be writing nature poetry or poetry about their grandmother. We write about whatever we should write about. But to me, that is frequently something I want to bring up. But I feel it's very disingenuous, very inauthentic for me to discuss that without recognizing my privilege in some manner, usually lightly, but in some manner within the poem. So I personally, there are differences of opinions on this, of course, but I personally would never write a persona poem. I wouldn't write from the point of view, for example, of a person of color. I don't feel comfortable with that. That doesn't feel comfortable for me at all. But, so it's more like writing from the outside. I'm outside on all of this, nothing has ever happened. Growing up, I made lots of mistakes and was very foolish and did lots of not, ridiculous things like lots of people do, especially boys at that age. And I can only imagine what would have happened if I was a 16-year-old of color with some of the stuff that I got away with. So for me, writing these poems is always a matter of approaching it from the outside. I don't write these kinds of poems approaching it from the inside because I can't write a genuine poem about experiences I haven't had. So I try to always approach them, make it obvious that I'm approaching it from the outside looking in. So hopefully that's how I get away with it. Luckily have never once had anyone tell me, whether it's from the books or something been published or workshop. I've never been told that something struck someone the wrong way. But yeah, quite honestly, every single poem that has any sort of political or cultural ramifications at all, I'm absolutely petrified before I hit send to send it to journals or read it out loud. Absolutely petrified every time.
Fabulous answer. I understand that anxiety. Another great question from Star Colebrook, and Star is also a wonderful poet and probably the most important mentor Natalie and I had as undergraduate students. Star mentions that she loved the bright images and muted images, and she loved that sanded moon. How do you imagine, construe, create these? And I would sort of add to that question, and that your work seems to walk a line of subtle control and like effervescent passion, and it's sort of the same place. How do you do that, man?
Well, I think with what you said, I don't think I do that. The part that you mentioned, I don't think I do on purpose. I think that's just part of the voice. I am emotionally speaking, I'm a very, at least outwardly, very controlled person. I don't usually seek help with, I think that comes from a certain lineage. I come from, Irish Boston labor stock. So we don't talk about emotions. So I tend to deal with things I tend to deal with things like that myself. I'm not controlling, but I'm very controlled. People don't know if there's something wrong, for better or worse. So I think that I feel that way similarly with poetry. I feel like I am trying to control every word, but then as I do that, it's inevitable, and I think every poem that I write, there are points where I lose control, hopefully in a good way, but there are points where I actually I lose control, like the passion that's in there that I'm trying to kind of keep down as a human being, it just kind of erupts within the poem. So I'm really glad you mentioned that. That's something I've noticed now and again where, there's an image and it's just, you can just tell, right, that I'm just looking at a poem here, where, maybe there's an image and you could just, if hearing it out loud, it's just, you can tell that, paying attention to the syllables and it's do. And then it just gets to a point where suddenly there's just one or two lines that are just more ecstatic, And I think that's the real me trying to leap through the controlled aspect. But in terms of the creation of the images, I know a lot of my poems are very image heavy. I think they almost always have been. And that's partly just how I construct poems. I don't usually know, I almost never know what a poem's about going into it. Sometimes not even when I'm done with it. Mainly, I really focus, most of the time I start poems with images. Like that's where the thought comes from. A certain thing will strike me. I saw, what was one of the poems over there with this 1,000 unpainted churches, steeples snapped off like baby teeth in an apple. I had seen during a cross-country trip some decades ago, and everything just kind of goes in your head and it just always stays there. And then when a certain poem wants it, the image is waiting for you. And I had seen that. I'd seen a steeple upside down, just sticking out of the ground of a church that obviously had lost theirs. I totally forgot I'd even seen that. I never took a picture of it. And then I was writing this poem, I was like, that image just showed up. So I'm very image heavy. And I tend to, generally I'll find a couple images. I got the baby teeth, biting into an apple, stuff like that. I get a couple images and I try to weave a world for those images to exist in. So honestly, the content for me, the content usually comes later. I usually focus on the imagery, and then from the images and the world I'm trying to create for the images, then the meaning pops out from there. So I think that might be why I very heavily focus on the images and very often trying to create contrasts within those. A very dark thing happening, but using very ecstatic and bright imagery, or vice versa. If I have a poem that's even remotely happy, it's probably going to be raining during it, because I'm always looking for those contrasts.
Yeah, that's interesting. As a really visual person, it really resonates with me. So.
Oh.
So Willie says, poet B.J. Buckley once told, there are two ways to write a book. One, to think of a concept for the book and follow through on it, or two, to just write and see what book emerges afterwards. After reading your book, I was really curious which one more closely mirrors your writing process.
Before I answer, Willie, can you type in there, which one do you think? Type 1 or type 2? Ah, yeah, definitely. You're right. I thought you were going to say the other one, especially because, since I know you've read it, especially because more than the other, as one fire consumes another, seems like it had a goal to begin with. Every poem is very tight in that regard, thematically. But no, I've never done that before, not once. I don't know how many times I've sat down and be like, you know, I'm going to write a love poem for my wife for our anniversary. I'm going to write a love poem, and then by the end of it, I'm like, oh crap, it's about my mother's dementia. It's just I can't tell a poem what it wants to do. I can't. I don't know how anyone could tell a poem what it wants to do. I don't know what a poem wants to do until it's totally done. Sometimes I think I have the poem, and then I get to the very last line. I'm like, oh no. Like, I'm a big fan of doing this, where like the last line or last couple lines, hi puppy, the last couple lines will suddenly change the context of the poem when you get to the end. And I'm a big fan, and I don't know that until I've done it. So yeah, I haven't gone into the either of the books, any of the books, with a specific set. I just write, and then something inside, a voice just tells you, no, you're done with this, you know. And it could be, you know, there's probably, I don't know, 60 poems in the book, and it started at like 100, and you just whittle down. But in each case, something in my gut just told me, yeah, you've written enough. You're going to find themes in here, you know. Take a couple of weeks and do that. And then for me, if it matters, for me, I print out every poem I'm even considering, you know, putting in a collection, and then I go through it and I mark 1, 2, 3 at the top of each page. You know, the 1 being, yeah, this is definitely going to make it in. 2, maybe. So most of them are 2s. And then a 3, no, this obviously isn't going to work. And then I just keep whittling down. And then I usually take a little notes, like I'll put family or politics, or like a little note in the corner too. So that I go through, it's easier to group them and things like that. And then I just whittle down until I have only what I would subjectively consider the best poems for it. So it's, yeah. No, I have no idea what I'm doing until it's totally done. I don't know how people do it the other way. How can you sit down and like, I'm doing this? What if that's not what you want to write that day? It seems odd. Because inspiration just kind of, it does what it does.
Cool. We've sort of been following the typed question format, but I want to make sure, since we have time for a couple more questions, if anyone wants to ask just over camera and mic, or just mic, please do. Yeah, I understand. It can be hard with Zoom to toggle between all the things that are happening, from all the faces, the text, the John on the big screen. So yeah, if you have a question, please chime in.
Yeah, actually, John, hi. I was curious about the landscapes that you have in your poetry, and wondered what particular landscapes have you been drawn to, that like actual landscapes that stay within your imagination, that help to create those landscapes in your poems.
So the land, you mean the landscapes in the real landscapes?
Right. Yeah.
That's interesting. And I'm sure maybe everyone knows this, but just in case, whenever I say this, there's at least one person that's like, really? Is that poetry is, if it had to be lumped in fiction or nonfiction, it's fiction, right? We're not writing memoir. You know, I mean, a lot of poems could be narrative, they could be experiential, but at heart, it's fictionalized, right? It's dramatized. So some of the landscapes I reference, I haven't actually been, most I have, but some I haven't actually been to. I invent characters, even family members, because for me, the big thing, and this works the landscape too, for me, the big thing is, there's a difference between truth and facts. So the facts of a situation could be one thing, but then the truth I got out of that situation, maybe the best way to convey it to someone else is by changing up characters, you know? So there are poems, there's something that happened to me in Oregon, but I make it take place in the desert, or something happened with my father, or something happened with my mother, but somehow I think the potential violence of potential violence for a father gets at that bigger truth more. So then the poem has my father instead of my mother in it. So I play with the facts a lot in order to get at what I consider the deeper truth of the situation. And so with landscape, a lot of it for me is, or how I select those, is usually there's something landscape based usually that really haunts me. I don't know what it is, a little image. You know, I used to spend summers parts of summers in Iowa, where part of my family's from. And so, you know, I remember, you know, there's a silo and an old rusty, and this is from childhood, this image, and a empty silo, an old rusty pitchfork leaned up against it. That one image ended up birthing a 2-page poem 30 years later. So it's hard to say exactly where the landscapes come from. Some I've seen, some I do just kind of make up, and some I change the context of. But generally, I mean, who doesn't, right? I mean, you're driving down the road. Long drives are the best. I've gotten a lot of my imagery from a cross-country trip I took a couple months doing about 15 years ago. And I don't have notes, they're just all in my head. But even, you know, you're driving down and if you just drive around and you just keep your eyes open, everything becomes something else. Like, we're all children. I love having 4-year-olds. You know, they'll just say the moon is XYZ, you know, the moon is this other thing, a face or something like that. They see that way. And I think we train ourselves not to see that way. But if you just try your best to see that way, when you're driving around, every single thing you see, a power line becomes something. Or in your mind, suddenly you're going to throw some tennis shoes, old tennis shoes up on that power line in your head. You know, everything can become an image. So I think I plucked some from reality, some I kind of make up, and yeah, I don't know. I love landscape, but I don't love landscape poems that are all about landscape. I like when landscape is brought into poems in order to accentuate something else.